In the heart of a distant, shadowy forest, where the towering trees whispered of ancient secrets and the winds carried songs of the earth, there lived a small, dark-haired girl named Nyra. Her skin, kissed by the sun, was the color of warm earth, and her eyes sparkled with the curious brightness of someone who had not yet seen the world's cruel edges. Nyra lived with her mother, a kind-hearted woman named Amara, in a small, humble wooden hut just at the edge of the forest, a place where the wildness of the trees met the peaceful rhythm of the village. The forest was their home, but the village too was close enough for the villagers to bring herbs and flour, and stories of the wider world. Nyra's life was filled with warmth. Her mother's laughter echoed through the woods like the song of birds, and the stories Amara told, of the forest's hidden magic and the creatures who roamed it, filled Nyra's heart with a kind of wonder she would carry for the rest of her life. The world, to young Nyra, seemed so full of beauty, of hope, of love. But that world was shattered one cruel winter. A sickness, cold and unyielding, swept through the village like a shadow. It crept into Amara's heart, stealing her strength day by day. Nyra watched helplessly as the vibrant woman who had cared for her with boundless love grew weaker, her face pale and strained, her smile fading with each passing day. Nyra gathered herbs, brewed teas, and did everything her young hands could manage, but the sickness would not be stopped. And then, one quiet, heartbreaking night, her mother's breath faltered, and Amara was gone, leaving only the scent of the forest and the silence of her empty hut. But the sorrow of that loss was only the beginning. In their grief, the villagers took no interest in Nyra. They saw only a lost child, no parents to care for her, no use for her presence in their tightly woven community. No one stepped forward to offer her a home, no arms reached out to give comfort. They left her standing alone, her small hands clutching the worn cloak of her mother, as the village closed its doors and hearts to her. Abandoned by the very people who had once been her neighbors, Nyra turned to the forest. It was there, alone under the vast, indifferent sky, that she found a new family, the wolves. Their eyes, dark and ancient, did not judge her grief. The Alpha, a majestic wolf with silver fur like moonlight, approached her without fear, his gaze wise and understanding. He nudged her gently, and from that moment, Nyra became one with the wild. The wolves took her in, teaching her their ways, and the forest embraced her as one of its own. Years passed in this new life. The small girl who had once known only the hearth and home of her mother grew strong, her heart now wild and untamed like the wolves that surrounded her. Her hair darkened with the seasons, flowing like the rivers, and her skin grew rich and sun-warmed from the earth that was now her bed. She hunted with the wolves, learned their language, and lived in harmony with the creatures of the forest. But despite the peace she found among the wolves, there were nights when loneliness crept in. When the wind carried memories of the village, when she felt the absence of the love she had lost. On those nights, she would climb to the highest peak, gazing at the village that still lay beyond the trees, and the ache in her heart would stir again. She would whisper her mother's name into the night air, and the wolves would gather around her, their howls rising in a chorus of mourning and remembrance. Then, many years later, one cold, bitter autumn, the village that had once abandoned her found itself desperate. A terrible blight had struck the crops, and famine crept over the land like a gnawing shadow. The villagers, starved and afraid, knew of Nyra, the wolves' maiden who had once been one of them. Their desperation reached such a point that, despite their pride and their fear of the wild, they sought her out. They ventured into the forest, trembling as the trees seemed to close in around them. They sent word, begging for Nyra's help, for the woman they had once abandoned. Nyra's heart hardened as she heard the cries of the village. Their voices reached her like a distant echo, but she could not ignore them, not entirely. Despite the hurt, the years of silence, of being cast aside in her deepest grief, she knew that the village was not truly asking for her. They were asking for the forest's magic, for the strength of the wild that had claimed her. They had no choice but to come to her, desperate for what she could give. A part of her, bitter and scarred, wanted to turn them away. They had abandoned her when she was lost, left her mother to die without a word of comfort. But there was still something in her heart, a trace of the girl she had once been, the daughter who had known love and warmth, that could not turn away. The wild within her knew no such cruelty. Nyra climbed from her perch in the trees, her dark hair flowing around her like a cloak, and descended into the village, her heart torn between the fierce independence the wolves had taught her and the traces of the girl who once loved her mother and hoped the villagers might love her too. When the villagers saw her, they recoiled at first. The wolves' maiden was no longer the soft, gentle girl they once knew. She was wild, untamed, and powerful, her presence a reminder of all that had been abandoned. But when they saw the strength in her eyes, the wild grace with which she moved, they knew they had no other choice. They begged her, their voices tinged with the desperation of their hunger and fear. Nyra listened, her heart heavy. She remembered the warmth of her mother's smile, and the way the villagers had turned away when she needed them most. But she also remembered the forest, the wolves, and how they had shown her a love deeper than anything she had known before. With a sigh, Nyra agreed to help. She would guide them to the forest's heart, where the earth's magic flowed freely. She would teach them how to live in harmony with nature, how to seek the forest's gifts without exploiting it. And in return, the villagers would learn the true value of what they had once taken for granted. Despite the deep hurt she carried in her heart, Nyra chose to help them. She chose to share the wild magic she had learned, to offer the village a chance to live as one with the earth, just as she had. As the villagers followed her back into the forest, their eyes wide with wonder and fear, Nyra realized that perhaps this was what the forest had taught her all along. To be wild, yes, but also to show compassion, even to those who had hurt her. In the end, Nyra, the wolves' maiden, was both part of the wild and the village. She had healed the land and its people, and in doing so, she had healed herself. And when the moon rose high above the village, when the wolves howled in the distance, Nyra stood among the trees, her heart wild and free, knowing she had found her place in both worlds.